Oops, we forgot your seat, my sister giggled, twirling in her custom $15,000 wedding gown. My mother pointed me toward the exit, hissing that my presence was embarrassing her wealthy new white-in-laws. I just smiled, pulled out my phone and replied, "Do not worry, it looks like we both forgot something." Before the wedding cake was even cut, the music stopped and my sister was in tears begging me to come back. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. The Atlanta Botanical Garden Ballroom was transformed into a sickeningly lavish display of wealth. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, reflecting the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. A live string quartet played in the corner, while waiters in immaculate white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. It was the absolute pinnacle of high society elegance, carefully manufactured to impress the old money elite of the city. And I had paid for every single cent of it. I walked into the grand foyer holding a small velvet box containing a vintage watch I had spent months tracking down for my sister. I had spent my entire morning putting out fires with the wedding vendors, authorizing wire transfers from my personal accounts to ensure Chloe had the fairy tale day she had always demanded. I wore a tailored emerald green suit, sharp and professional, a stark contrast to the sea of ruffled pastel gowns and traditional tuxedos surrounding me. I did not care about fitting into their restrictive aesthetic. I was just there to support my family. I approached the massive mirrored seating chart at the entrance. The cursive gold lettering listed over 300 guests, divided into meticulously arranged tables. I scanned the names under the head family tables, expecting to see my name right next to my parents. It was not there. I checked the secondary family tables. Nothing. I read through the entire list of 300 names twice. My name was completely absent. Before I could even process the disrespect, a high-pitched laugh echoed behind me. I turned to see my sister Chloe surrounded by a flock of bridesmaids. She looked radiant in her heavily beaded gown, clutching a bouquet of rare white roses that I had personally wired an extra $5,000 for just 2 days prior. "Oh my goodness, Jada, you actually came," Chloe said, feigning surprise as she strutted toward me. Her bridesmaids exchanged knowing smirks. I stood my ground, holding her wedding gift. "What do you mean I actually came, Chloe? I am your sister. I helped plan this entire event. Why is my name not on the seating chart?" Chloe pouted her lips in a grotesque display of fake sympathy. "Oops, we forgot your seat." "Well, we did not really forget. It is just that Spencer was finalizing the seating arrangements last night, and he felt your vibe was a little too corporate. You know how his family is. The Kensingtons are very traditional old money, and Spencer thought your whole independent boss lady attitude just did not match the VIP aesthetic we are going for tonight. He said you always look like you are about to fire someone. You can stand in the back near the bar, though, if you really want to stay." I stared at her, letting the absolute audacity of her words wash over me. My own sister, the woman whose lifestyle I had fully funded for the past 6 years, was telling me I was not good enough to sit at a table I had bought. She was prioritizing the fragile ego of her broke white husband over her own flesh and blood. Spencer was a man who projected an image of generational wealth, but actually ran a failing startup. I knew his real financial status, but I had kept my mouth shut to keep the peace. Before I could formulate a response, the heavy scent of expensive perfume announced my mother's arrival. Patricia marched over, her face tight with irritation. She wore a champagne-colored gown that blatantly violated the rule against wearing white to a wedding. But Patricia never cared about rules unless she was using them to judge someone else. "Jada, what on earth are you doing standing here interrogating the bride?" my mother hissed, grabbing my arm with a painful grip. Her acrylic nails dug into my sleeve. I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "My name is not on the seating chart, Mom. Chloe just told me Spencer decided I do not fit the aesthetic of his family." Instead of defending me, my mother's face contorted with embarrassment. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "Well, look at you, Jada. You showed up to a high-society black-tie wedding wearing a business suit. You look like you are heading to a board meeting. The Kensingtons are an extremely prominent family, Spencer's parents flew in from their estate in Connecticut. We are finally establishing our place in the upper echelon of society, and you are acting difficult. I am acting difficult, I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Mom, I paid for the orchids hanging above your head. I paid for the champagne you are currently drinking. I paid for the dress you are wearing. Keep your voice down, Patricia snapped, glancing around frantically to see if any of the white guests were listening. Why must you always throw money in our faces? You are so classless. This is exactly what Spencer meant. You have no refinement. You work all day and night accumulating wealth, but you have no idea how to behave in polite society. Do not ruin your sister's big day with your ghetto attitude. If you cannot respect the elegance of this event, just leave. Go home, Jada. Do not embarrass us. The betrayal was absolute. For years, I had been the scapegoat of this family. I was the one who worked multiple jobs through college because they drained my savings to pay off Chloe's credit card debt. I was the one who built a venture capital firm from the ground up, working 100-hour weeks while they called me selfish for missing Sunday dinners. I was the one who quietly paid the mortgage on their heavily leveraged mansion so they could continue hosting their pretentious country club friends. I sacrificed my own peace to give them a life of luxury, and this was my reward. Being banished from the room because my success made a mediocre man feel insecure. I looked at Chloe, who was watching me with a smug, victorious smile. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed that marrying a white man with a fake pedigree made her superior to me. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were filled with nothing but contempt for her eldest daughter. They expected me to cry. They expected me to argue, to beg for a seat at their table, or to storm out in a fit of emotional rage, validating their narrative that I was an angry, unstable woman. But I felt no anger. I felt nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. The invisible chains of family obligation that had bound me to these toxic people simply evaporated. I gently pried my mother's fingers off my arm, brushing my sleeve as if dusting off dirt. I understand, Mom. I said, my voice perfectly steady and eerily quiet. You are absolutely right. I do not fit in here. I will leave immediately and let you enjoy the elegance of the Kensington family. My mother let out a loud breath of relief. Thank you, Jada. It is for the best. Maybe we can get lunch next week when things settle down. Chloe giggled again. Thanks for understanding, sis. You can leave the gift on the table over there. I looked down at the velvet box in my hand. I smiled warmly, slipped the box into my pocket, and pulled out my phone. Do not worry, Chloe. I will take myself and my ghetto attitude out of your fairy tale. But it looks like I forgot something too. I turned my back on them and locked eyes with the event director, Julian, who was standing near the entrance overseeing the waitstaff. I waved him over. Julian, a meticulous man who had been coordinating with my assistant for 6 months, hurried over with a clipboard in his hand. Ms. Williams, he said politely, ignoring my mother and sister. Is everything all right with the setup? The caviar service is about to begin, and the main courses are perfectly on schedule. Julian, everything looks beautiful, I said loud enough for my mother and sister to hear clearly. However, there has been a slight change of plans. It seems I am not a guest at this wedding. I do not even have a seat. And since I am not a guest, I am certainly not the host. Julian looked confused, glancing between me and the bride. I do not understand, Ms. Williams. You are the sole financier on the master contract. Exactly, I replied, tapping my phone screen. I forgot to sign the final authorization for the $200,000 invoice covering the catering, the floral arrangements, the open bar, and the venue staff overtime. Since my family has informed me that Spencer Kensington is the true visionary behind tonight's aesthetic, I am officially removing myself from all financial obligations. Cancel my black card on file immediately. Do not charge a single cent to my name. The color drained entirely from Julian's face. Ms. Williams, if we do not process that final payment right now, I have strict orders from the venue owners to halt all services. We cannot serve the food. We cannot serve the alcohol. The staff will have to clear the tables. I smiled at him. Then you better speak to the groom. I hear the Kensingtons are very wealthy. I am sure Spencer has a card you can swipe. Have a wonderful evening, Julian. I turned to look at my mother and sister one last time. Patricia's mouth was hanging open, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. Chloe looked like she had just been struck by lightning. The smugness was completely wiped from her face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. "Jada, wait!" Chloe stammered, reaching her hand out toward me. "You cannot do that. The food is already cooked. The guests are sitting down." I stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Oops," I said, mimicking her exact tone from minutes earlier. "I guess you should have planned better, Chloe. Enjoy your old money aesthetic." I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand exit. My posture was perfectly straight, my head held high. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the satisfying echo of my heels against the marble floor serve as the final punctuation to our relationship. As I reached the massive glass doors, I heard the distinct sound of the string quartet grinding to a sudden, awkward halt. The beautiful classical music died, instantly replaced by the confused murmurs of 300 wealthy guests. I glanced over my shoulder one final time. Julian was marching straight past my mother and sister, heading directly for the head table where Spencer was laughing with his groomsmen. Julian was holding up his clipboard, his face red with stress, loudly demanding a new form of payment before his staff could bring out the first course. Spencer's confident smile vanished instantly as he frantically patted his tuxedo pockets. I pushed the glass doors open and stepped out into the warm Atlanta night. The valet brought my Porsche around immediately. I handed him $100 bill, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. My phone was already starting to light up with incoming calls from my mother, but I simply muted the device. The war had officially begun, and I had already won the first battle without raising my voice. The twin-turbo engine of my Porsche roared as I merged onto the Atlanta highway. The cool night air rushed through the open windows, but it was not enough to cool the burning clarity in my chest. For the first time in 32 years, I had chosen myself. I gripped the leather steering wheel, letting the streetlights blur into long streaks of yellow and white. My mind raced back to the very beginning of this toxic dynamic. It was never just about a seat at a wedding. It was about a lifetime of being treated like a disposable wallet by the people who were supposed to protect me. I remembered the exact afternoon my entire worldview shattered into pieces. I was 19 years old and working double shifts at a greasy diner to save up for my final year of college. I smelled like stale coffee every single day, but I did not care because I was building my future. I had rushed home excited to check the balance of the college fund my grandparents had set up for me. When I logged into the bank account, the balance read zero. Panic had seized my throat instantly. I ran down to the living room where my parents were admiring a stack of designer shopping bags on the sofa. Chloe was trying on a diamond necklace, giggling about her upcoming semester abroad in Paris. When I asked where my tuition money went, my mother, Patricia, did not even have the decency to look guilty. She simply adjusted her silk robe and sighed like I was being a massive nuisance. She told me Chloe needed the money more because she had racked up $60,000 in credit card debt, trying to maintain her wealthy image among her college friends. Patricia had looked me up and down with absolute disgust in her eyes. She said I was strong enough to work for my tuition, but Chloe was fragile and needed to be protected. Chloe was the beautiful princess who needed to be polished so she could marry into old money and elevate the family name. My father Richard had chimed in without missing a single beat. He called me the ugly workhorse of the family right to my face. He said my role was to provide the foundation so Chloe could secure our social standing in the elite circles of Atlanta. They expected me to simply accept that my future was collateral damage for her endless vanity. I moved out that same night with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart. I spent the next decade proving them completely wrong. I built my venture capital firm from the ground up, working until my eyes bled. I became a millionaire by 28 and a multimillionaire by 30. But instead of cutting them off, I foolishly tried to buy their love and approval. I thought if I provided the luxury they craved, they would finally respect me as a daughter. I quietly paid off the mortgage on their heavily leveraged mansion to save them from foreclosure. I funded their expensive country club memberships so they could rub elbows with the black elite of the city. I paid for Chloe to live a life of total leisure while she hunted for a wealthy husband. And when she finally found Spencer Kensington, a white man who projected an image of generational wealth, My family treated him like a god descending from heaven. They worshipped him because his skin color and fake pedigree gave them the ultimate status symbol they so desperately desired. They never cared that Spencer was actually broke and drowning in debt. I knew the painful truth because my firm ran extensive financial background checks on him before the engagement. I knew his tech startup was bleeding cash and facing multiple lawsuits, but I stayed silent to keep the fragile family peace. That silence officially ended tonight. The digital display on my dashboard lit up, signaling an incoming barrage of messages and voicemails. The Bluetooth system automatically began playing the first audio message over the car speakers. It was Spencer. His usually smooth prep school accent was completely gone, replaced by the frantic stammering of a cornered scammer. Jada, you need to call the venue right now, he yelled into the phone with pure terror in his voice. The caterers are packing up the food and demanding immediate payment before they serve anyone. My trust fund transfer is just delayed by a few hours because of an international banking error, so I just need you to cover this temporarily. He begged me to reactivate my black card, promising to pay me back by Monday morning. It was incredibly pathetic. A supposedly wealthy tech founder begging his black sister-in-law to buy his wedding dinner because he could not even afford the appetizers. The voicemail ended, and the system immediately began reading a rapid string of text messages from my father. Richard was spiraling into a total rage. He typed that I was a massive disgrace to the black upper class and a bitter spinster. He said I was intentionally trying to humiliate him in front of his wealthy white in-laws, who were already looking down on them. He demanded I turn the car around and fix the situation before the Kensington family left the botanical garden in absolute disgust. The irony was almost suffocating. The very people he was so desperate to impress were nothing but a mirage of stolen status and empty bank accounts. I did not respond to any of the cruel messages. I just kept driving, letting the city skyline grow closer and brighter against the dark sky. Suddenly, an incoming call from my mother filled the screen. I decided to answer it just to hear the reality of the situation firsthand. The moment the call connected, a wave of chaotic background noise flooded the quiet cabin of my car. I could hear the distinct sound of silverware clattering loudly and angry voices echoing in the large ballroom. Patricia was hyperventilating into the receiver. Her voice was shrill and strained with sheer panic and disbelief. "Jada, what did you do?" she screamed over the noise of the angry crowd. "The event director is threatening to call the police for theft of services, and they are locking the doors." "You ruined your sister's perfect wedding," Patricia continued, her voice breaking into hysterical sobs. "Spencer's family is walking out the door right now because there is no food, and the open bar has been completely shut down. People are whispering about us and pointing fingers. The country club ladies are laughing at me and filming this entire disaster on their phones. How could you be so evil and vindictive to your own family?" I listened to her frantic panic with a profound sense of absolute peace. The maternal bond that had tethered me to her toxicity for over 3 decades was completely severed in that very moment. I took a deep breath and spoke with chilling clarity. "Mom, I did not ruin anything," I said softly. "I simply stopped paying for a party I was not invited to attend." Patricia gasped loudly, as if I had physically struck her across the face. "But you know we cannot afford this massive bill," she cried out, forgetting her usual haughty demeanor completely. "We will be ruined financially and socially. We will be the laughingstock of all Atlanta society by tomorrow morning." I smiled a genuine smile, even though she could not see it through the phone. "Why are you worrying, Mom?" I asked innocently. "You have Spencer by your side. He is old money, right? He is a brilliant tech chief executive officer with boundless resources and a rich family. Have him pull out his black card and save the day. Let him show you the generational wealth you were so proud to parade around all evening instead of giving your own daughter a seat at the table." There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. I knew Patricia was looking at Sir right at that moment, realizing he had absolutely nothing to offer them. The grand illusion she had built her entire identity around was breaking into a million irreparable pieces. "Enjoy the rest of the beautiful evening, Mom," I said before tapping the steering wheel button to end the call. I blocked her number immediately. I blocked Richard and Chloe and Spencer too. I wanted absolute silence for the rest of my drive home. I navigated through the busy downtown streets until I reached the private underground garage of my luxury penthouse building. The heavy iron security gates closed behind my car, shutting out the chaos and noise of the outside world. I parked in my reserved spot and took the private express elevator straight up to the top floor. The steel doors opened directly into my personal sanctuary. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of modern minimalism, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city. It was a space I had bought with my own blood, sweat, and relentless tears. There were no fake smiles here, no pretending to be someone I was not just to appease people who secretly hated me. I kicked off my designer heels, leaving them by the door, and walked barefoot across the heated marble floors. I moved toward the custom glass bar area and poured myself a generous glass of rare vintage red wine. I walked over to the massive windows and looked down at the tiny city lights glowing below in the darkness. Somewhere out there, my family was dealing with the catastrophic public fallout of their own blinding arrogance. They had pushed me away, assuming I would just quietly accept the disrespect and continue writing massive checks from the shadows as I always did. They had severely miscalculated my breaking point, and now they were paying the ultimate price for their cruelty. I took a slow sip of the rich wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I felt incredibly safe in my high tower. I felt untouchable by their petty manipulations and constant financial drains. But toxic families never let go that easily. They view a daughter's independence as a direct act of war against their comfort and entitlement. Just as I raised the glass to my lips for a second sip, the secure intercom system on my wall began to chime loudly. The sharp ringing sound echoed violently through the quiet penthouse, shattering my temporary peace. I frowned, setting the wine glass down heavily on the sleek kitchen island. I walked over to the security panel and pressed the speaker button to answer. Yes, I asked, expecting it to be a routine late-night delivery or a neighbor needing building assistance. The voice of the night security guard crackled through the speaker, sounding incredibly tense and urgent. Ms. Jada, I am so sorry to disturb you so late, he said rapidly. There is a serious physical situation down here in the lobby. Your parents and your sister just bypassed the main security gate by tailgating another resident into the secure garage. They pushed past the lobby desk before my team could stop them physically. They are in the private elevator heading to your floor right now. The guard paused, taking a nervous, heavy breath. And Ms. Jada, they look absolutely furious and out of control. Do you want me to call the police immediately to have them removed from the premises? I stared at the blinking red light on the intercom panel as the harsh reality of the situation fully set in. The war was far from over. It was just coming directly to my front door, and this time I was ready to burn everything to the ground. The red light on the security intercom blinked a steady warning in the dim light of my penthouse. My night guard had just informed me that my parents and sister were in the private elevator heading straight for my floor. I did not panic. I simply set my wine glass down on the marble counter and waited. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime. They spilled into my foyer like a chaotic hurricane of tulle and ruined expectations. Chloe was at the front of the pack. Her custom $15,000 wedding dress was torn at the hem and stained with what looked like cheap red wine. Her perfectly styled hair was falling out in messy chunks around her face, and mascara was smeared down her cheeks in thick black rivers. Patricia followed closely behind her, clutching her designer purse like a weapon. Richard brought up the rear, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. They looked absolutely unhinged. The sheer contrast between my calm, quiet sanctuary and their frantic energy was staggering. I stood barefoot in the center of the living room, wearing my silk robe, watching them storm into my home without a shred of basic respect or decency. Chloe immediately began screaming the moment she saw me standing there. She threw her hands in the air, pacing back and forth across my living room floor. She yelled that I had completely destroyed the most important day of her entire life. She sobbed violently, describing how the venue staff had aggressively packed up the premium steaks and lobster tails the second the payment declined. Instead of the lavish 5-course meal they had bragged about to all their wealthy friends, The catering staff had left out bowls of stale crackers and tap water before walking off the job entirely. Chloe cried so hard she was hyperventilating. She said Spencer and his family were absolutely humiliated. His wealthy white relatives from Connecticut had complained about the lack of food and walked out of the botanical garden before the cake was even brought out. They whispered that Chloe and her family were nothing but broke frauds trying to put on a show they could not afford. The country club ladies, Patricia desperately wanted to impress, had pulled out their phones and filmed the entire disaster. The footage was probably already circulating through the Atlanta High Society group chats. "You did this to me!" Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You did this because you are a jealous, bitter woman who cannot stand to see me happy and successful." I just looked at her with pure exhaustion. I asked her how exactly I was jealous of a woman who just got kicked out of her own wedding reception because her supposedly rich husband could not even cover the cost of the appetizers. Richard stepped forward, pushing Chloe gently behind him so he could take control of the situation. He tried to puff out his chest and use the same intimidating tone he used to terrify me when I was a child. He pointed a finger at me and demanded that I sit down and listen to him. I did not move a single inch. I reminded him that he was standing in my house, a property I owned completely, and he was not in a position to give me any orders. Richard ignored my warning and launched into a furious lecture about family loyalty and the preservation of our image. He said my actions tonight were a direct attack on the black upper class of Atlanta. He told me that I had shamed our bloodline in front of old money white people, and that the damage to our social standing was catastrophic and unforgivable. Then he demanded that I write a check for $300,000 right there on the spot. I stared at him, making sure I heard him correctly. I asked him to repeat the number. He said $300,000 was the absolute minimum I owed them. He claimed $200,000 was to cover the venue costs, and the remaining $100,000 was for the severe emotional damages I had inflicted upon his favorite daughter. He said Chloe and Spencer needed that money immediately to plan a makeup reception and save their dignity. He threatened that if I did not write the check right now, he would officially disown me and ensure I was banned from every elite circle in the city. Patricia chimed in, stepping up to stand beside her husband. She crossed her arms and glared at me with pure venom in her eyes. She said Spencer was a brilliant tech chief executive officer with a massive portfolio. She claimed I had deliberately embarrassed him in front of his wealthy relatives because I was threatened by his intellect and status. She told me I owed Spencer a massive apology and a financial contribution to his new life with my sister. She said I should be grateful that a man of his caliber was even willing to marry into our family and elevate our social standing. The sheer delusion of their demands echoed in the quiet space of my penthouse. They had barged into my home in the middle of the night, demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix a problem they had created while defending a man who had intentionally excluded me from the celebration. They were using the exact same manipulative tactics they had used for the past decade, trying to guilt me into opening my wallet by attacking my character. But the old Jada was dead. The woman who used to crave their validation had died the moment Patricia told me to leave that ballroom. I looked at the three of them standing in my living room demanding my hard-earned wealth while treating me like trash. A slow, quiet laugh bubbled up in my chest. I tried to suppress it, but I could not. I started laughing right in their faces. My laughter grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings and glass windows. Chloe stopped crying and stared at me like I had lost my mind. Richard turned purple with rage. Patricia demanded to know what was so funny. I wiped a tear of pure amusement from my eye and took a step forward, closing the distance between us. I told them their audacity was genuinely inspiring. I asked them to clarify their logic. They had just trespassed into my home to demand $300,000 for a man who refused to even give me a chair at a table I had paid for. They expected me to fund a makeup reception for a wedding where I was deemed too ghetto to sit among the guests. I reminded them that I was the only reason they even had a house to sleep in tonight. I reminded them that I had paid off their mortgage 3 years ago when they were secretly facing foreclosure. I reminded them that Chloe had never worked a real job in her entire life because I had been silently funding her allowance to keep the family peace. I looked Richard dead in the eye and told him he could not disown me because I was the one who owned him. I told Patricia her social standing was a complete illusion built entirely on my bank accounts. And I told Chloe her wealthy husband was nothing but a broke scammer whose credit card declined over a simple catering bill. Richard stepped forward, raising his hand as if he were going to strike me. He yelled that I was a liar and a monster. Before he could even swing his arm forward, the two private security contractors I had quietly signaled moments earlier stepped out from the hallway shadows. They were massive, heavily built men, wearing tactical gear, and they moved with silent, terrifying speed. They positioned themselves directly between me and my furious family. I looked at my parents and my sister with absolute zero emotion. I told them this conversation was over. I told them they were trespassing on private property, and they had exactly 10 seconds to get back into the elevator before my security team physically removed them and called the police to press charges. Chloe started screaming again, thrashing her arms and demanding her money. Patricia tried to push past the guards, yelling that she was my mother and she had a right to be here. The security guards did not hesitate. They grabbed Richard by the arms and shoved him backward toward the elevator doors. They physically corralled Patricia and Chloe, forcing them out of my living space. The entire time, my family screamed curses and threats at me, calling me every terrible name they could think of. I simply turned my back on them, walked over to the kitchen island, and picked up my glass of wine. I took a slow sip as the heavy steel doors of the elevator finally slid shut, cutting off their screaming voices and removing their toxic presence from my home. The silence that followed was incredibly beautiful. It was the sound of complete freedom. I finished my wine, turned off the lights, and went to sleep feeling more rested than I had in years. The sun was shining brightly over the Atlanta skyline when I arrived at my venture capital firm the next morning. I walked into the sleek glass building wearing a sharp, tailored suit projecting the exact corporate energy Spencer had found so intimidating. My staff greeted me with respectful nods as I made my way to my corner office. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk and immediately pressed the button on my intercom system. I called in my lead investigator, Maya. She was a brilliant former forensic accountant who now handled all the deep background checks for my firm. Maya walked into my office a few moments later, holding a digital tablet and a notepad. She asked what I needed. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below me and then turned my attention back to her. I told Maya to dig into Spencer Kensington. I told her I wanted a complete and total financial autopsy on his life by noon. I explained that if he was truly a billionaire tech founder from old money, I needed to know exactly why his credit card had declined for a basic catering bill the night before. I told her to look into his startup, his family history, his tax returns, and every single hidden debt he might be concealing. Maya nodded, her eyes lighting up with the thrill of the hunt. She knew exactly what I was asking for. She turned and walked out of the office, closing the door behind her. I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers together. My family had pushed me too far, and they were about to learn a very painful lesson about the real cost of their vanity. They worshipped the illusion of wealth, but I controlled the reality of it. The war had escalated, and I was preparing to drop a bomb that would shatter their fake upper-class world forever. The previous night had been a profound turning point, but the morning light brought a cold, strategic calculation. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the financial statements connected to my family. The sheer amount of money I had bled to sustain their fragile egos was staggering. There were monthly transfers to Richard and Patricia to maintain the facade of their successful business, which had actually been failing for over a decade. There were the massive credit card bills. Chloe ran up buying designer bags and shoes to convince her followers that she was royalty. For years, I had rationalized these payments as the cost of keeping my family together. I thought I was being a good daughter and a supportive older sister. I believed that if I removed their financial stress, they would eventually have the emotional capacity to love me. But the wedding had exposed the brutal truth. My money did not buy their love, it only funded their abuse. They took my resources and used them to build a pedestal from which they could look down on me. I systematically began logging into every single shared account. With a few sharp clicks, I revoked Patricia and Richard's access to the emergency funds I had set up for them. I canceled the premium auto insurance policies I was paying for their luxury vehicles. I completely disabled Chloe's supplementary credit card, the one she had undoubtedly planned to use for her honeymoon expenses. I watched the digital confirmations flash across my screen indicating that the accounts were locked and the funds were secured. Every click felt like cutting a heavy chain that had been dragging me down since childhood. I was no longer their silent benefactor. I was no longer the ugly workhorse pulling their golden carriage. If they wanted to exist in the upper echelon of Atlanta society, they were going to have to fund it themselves. I knew they would panic when their cards started declining at their exclusive country club lunches and expensive boutique shopping trips. I knew they would realize very quickly that Spencer could not catch them when they fell. My assistant knocked lightly on the glass door of my office, pulling me from my thoughts. She carried the silver tray with my morning espresso and a stack of urgent briefing documents. She placed the coffee on my desk and mentioned that my phone had been ringing continuously with calls from unknown numbers. Likely my family trying to reach me from different devices since I had blocked their primary lines. I told her to screen all incoming calls and to absolutely under no circumstances put anyone from my family through to my office. I took a sip of the bitter dark espresso, letting the caffeine sharpen my focus. I had a multi-million-dollar firm to run, and I could not let their petty drama distract me from my responsibilities. I had meetings with major investors and pitch presentations from eager entrepreneurs. My life was moving forward at a relentless pace, and I refused to let their desperate attempts to drag me backwards succeed. I spent the next 2 hours immersed in high-stakes financial data, evaluating market trends and risk assessments. This was where I thrived, in the world of numbers and absolute truths, where fake pedigrees and social posturing meant absolutely nothing without real capital to back them up. I had built my entire empire by seeing through the lies people told to get funding. I knew how to spot a fraud from a mile away, and Spencer Kensington had every single hallmark of a classic con artist. My intercom buzzed again right at 11:45 in the morning. It was Maya. Her voice sounded tight and urgent through the speaker. She said she had the preliminary results of the financial autopsy and asked if she could come in immediately. I told her to bring it in. The moment she stepped through the door, I knew from the look on her face that she had found exactly what I suspected. The golden child's perfect husband was nothing but a house of cards, waiting for a single gust of wind to blow it all away. She placed a thick manila folder on my desk, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency. I asked her to give me the summary before I read through the raw data. She took a deep breath and began outlining the staggering scope of his deception. Spencer Kensington was not the heir to a vast fortune. His family had lost their wealth during a massive economic downturn in the late 90s and had been struggling to maintain appearances ever since. His highly publicized tech startup was a complete fabrication. It produced no actual software and generated absolutely zero revenue. Instead, he was using funds from new investors to pay off the initial backers, operating a textbook Ponzi scheme that was currently on the verge of total collapse. Maya pointed to a specific page in the dossier. She revealed that Spencer was currently over $5 million in debt. His personal credit score was completely ruined, and he had multiple outstanding warrants for unpaid civil judgments across 3 different states. He was desperately searching for a way to secure a massive influx of cash to prevent the federal authorities from uncovering his fraud. That was exactly why he had targeted my sister. Chloe spent every waking moment broadcasting an image of immense family wealth on social media. She constantly posted photos of the mansion I paid for, the luxury cars I insured, and the lavish vacations I funded. Spencer saw her as an easy mark. He firmly believed he was marrying into a bottomless pit of black wealth that he could effortlessly drain to save himself from prison. I leaned forward, staring at the documents with cold fascination. The pieces of the puzzle locked together perfectly. Spencer's sudden rush to marry Chloe, his insistence on a ridiculously expensive wedding, and his desperate attempt to push me out of the picture. He knew I was a venture capitalist. He knew I had the skills and resources to uncover his lies if I looked closely enough. He had deliberately orchestrated my exclusion from the wedding to ensure I would not be around to ask questions about his finances or notice the glaring inconsistencies in his background. He played my parents and my sister like a cheap instrument. He used their deeply ingrained colorism and desperate obsession with white old money to blind them to reality. Patricia and Richard were so eager to have a white son-in-law with a prestigious last name that they never bothered to verify if the name actually held any value. They gladly traded their successful black daughter for the mere illusion of white wealth. I thanked Maya for her exceptional work and instructed her to continue monitoring his accounts for any sudden movements. As she left my office, I felt a dark smile spread across my face. The stage was perfectly set for their total destruction. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind Maya, leaving me alone in the sprawling silence of my corner office. I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of Spencer's deception wash over me. The dossier on my desk was not just a collection of bank statements and court summons. It was a ticking time bomb wired directly to the foundation of my family's fragile social standing. Spencer Kensington was a master manipulator. He had recognized the desperate hunger in my parents' eyes from the very first moment he met them. He saw a black family, drowning in their own insecurity, willing to sacrifice anything to assimilate into the upper echelon of white Atlanta society. He knew Chloe was nothing but a vain, empty vessel, desperate for a fairy tale life she did not have to work for. But the most sickening part of his plan was how he factored me into it. He knew Chloe was constantly flaunting a lifestyle she could not afford. He saw the designer bags, the luxury cars, and the sprawling mansion he assumed. She was sitting on a massive trust fund. He had no idea that the generational wealth he thought he was marrying into was actually just a single, exhausted black woman working 100-hour weeks to keep her family out of bankruptcy. Spencer thought he had found the perfect mark. He planned to use my family to pay off his $5 million debt and fund his fraudulent tech startup when he realized I was the one holding the purse strings. He panicked. He knew a seasoned venture capitalist would eventually ask to see his financials. That was exactly why he convinced Chloe to exclude me from the wedding. He needed me out of the picture so he could drain my parents dry without any interference. It was a brilliant scam, but he made one fatal miscalculation. He underestimated my willingness to let them all burn. I leaned forward and placed both hands on the cool mahogany wood of my desk. A part of me, the wounded child who still craved her parents' approval, wanted to call them immediately. I wanted to rush over to their house and save them from the disaster they had blindly invited into their lives. But the woman I had become, the woman who was forced to build her own empire from the ashes of their rejection, knew better. They would never believe a word I said unless I forced them to look at the undeniable proof. I reached for my office phone and dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times before she finally answered. Her voice was clipped and dripping with resentment. She demanded to know why I was bothering her after the horrific trauma I had inflicted upon them the night before. I kept my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. I told her to meet me at their exclusive country club in exactly 1 hour. I told her to bring Richard because I had information about her new son-in-law that would permanently destroy their reputation if they did not listen to me. Patricia tried to argue, but I hung up the phone before she could formulate another insult. I gathered the thick dossier, slid it into a sleek leather briefcase, and walked out of my office. The drive to the Buckhead Country Club was a stark contrast to my frantic highway run the night before. The midday sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the pristine hoods of luxury vehicles lining the club driveway. This was Patricia's sanctuary, a highly restricted playground where she could sip mimosas and pretend she belonged among the elite. I parked my Porsche near the entrance and handed the keys to the valet. I walked up the sweeping stone steps, feeling the familiar weight of their pretentious world trying to push me down, but I was no longer susceptible to their elitist intimidation tactics. I walked straight through the grand lobby, ignoring the curious stares of the wealthy patrons. I found my parents sitting at a private table on the outdoor terrace, overlooking the immaculate green golf course. Patricia was wearing a pristine white tennis skirt and oversized sunglasses, trying desperately to project an image of unbothered wealth. Richard was sipping a scotch, looking visibly exhausted from the wedding fallout. They both stiffened. The moment they saw me approaching their table, I did not bother pulling out a chair to sit down. I stood towering over them and tossed the heavy leather briefcase directly onto the center of their table. It landed with a loud thud, rattling the delicate crystal glasses. Richard jumped slightly, his face flushing with immediate anger. He demanded to know what kind of theatrical stunt I was pulling now. He told me I had already done enough damage to the family name and ordered me to take my briefcase and leave before his friends saw us arguing. I ignored his demands completely. I popped the brass locks on the briefcase and pulled out the thick manila folder Maya had given me. I dropped it right on top of Patricia's expensive salad. I told them they needed to open that folder and read every single page carefully. I explained that their perfect white son-in-law was not a billionaire, tech genius. I told them the Kensington family had filed for bankruptcy over 2 decades ago and lost every dime of their old money fortune. I watched my mother's face contort with absolute disgust, but not at the information I was sharing. She was disgusted with me. She refused to even touch the folder. Patricia crossed her arms tightly over her chest and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She told me my jealousy had finally driven me completely insane, she said. I was so deeply bitter about being an unmarried workaholic that I was now fabricating financial documents to ruin my sister's happiness. Richard aggressively pushed the folder back toward me. He yelled that Spencer was a brilliant entrepreneur who was currently finalizing a massive round of funding for his revolutionary software company. He claimed Spencer had just secured Chloe an exclusive invitation to summer in the Hamptons with a prominent political family. They firmly believed that Spencer was their ultimate golden ticket to the top of the social ladder. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table to steady myself against their blinding ignorance. I kept my voice dangerously low so the neighboring tables could not hear the details of their impending ruin. I told them Spencer was running a massive Ponzi scheme. I explained that his tech company had zero revenue and zero functioning software. I told them he was over $5 million in debt, with multiple active warrants for unpaid civil judgments across 3 different states. I warned them that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was likely already building a wire fraud case against him. I looked deep into my mother's eyes, begging her to see the truth. I told her Spencer only married Chloe because he thought she had unlimited access to a massive family fortune. He was planning to drain their bank accounts to pay off his angry investors and save himself from federal prison. I told them, if they did not separate from him immediately, they would lose everything they had spent their entire lives trying to build. The silence that followed my warning was heavy and suffocating. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of doubt cross my father's face. He was a prideful man, but he was not completely stupid. The detailed bank records and legal documents spilling out of the folder were undeniably authentic. But Patricia's desperate need to maintain her social illusion was far stronger than any logic or reason. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the stone terrace. She grabbed the thick dossier and violently slapped it onto the floor, sending papers scattering across the patio. Patricia pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her voice trembling with absolute rage. She told me I was a sick, vindictive liar. She screamed that I could not stand the fact that Chloe had succeeded where I had failed, she said. Chloe had secured a powerful, wealthy husband while I was destined to die alone, surrounded by nothing but my cold corporate bank accounts. Patricia declared that Spencer was family now, and they would protect him from my malicious smear campaign at all costs. Richard stood up to join her, presenting a united front of pure toxic delusion. He told me I was officially dead to them. He commanded me to never contact them again. He banned me from their home, from their lives, and from every future family function. He said they were completely done dealing with my toxic ghetto behavior, and they would rather sever ties with me forever than let me poison Chloe's beautiful new marriage. I looked at the papers blowing across the expensive stone patio. The definitive proof of their incoming destruction was literally at their feet, and they actively chose to step right over it. A profound sense of closure washed over me. I had done my duty. I had tried to warn them. Their blood was no longer on my hands. I did not argue or plead. I simply nodded my head in quiet acceptance. I told them to enjoy their new son-in-law and to remember this exact conversation. When the illusion finally shattered, I turned around and walked away, leaving the documents scattered on the ground for the country club staff to sweep up like garbage. I drove back to my office feeling a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The final threads binding me to their manipulation had been cleanly cut by their own hands. I spent the rest of the afternoon focusing entirely on my firm, reviewing investment portfolios, and directing my team to close a major acquisition. The hours passed productively, shielding my mind from the emotional wreckage of the morning. The sun began to set, casting a brilliant orange glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I was just packing up my briefcase to head home when a sharp, loud ping echoed from my desktop computer. It was a specialized automated alert from my firm's high-risk lending algorithm. My firm had recently acquired a secondary shadow banking institution that specialized in high-interest bridge loans for desperate clients. I had set up specific keyword alerts for any transactions moving through the Atlanta metropolitan area. I walked back to my desk and clicked open the secure notification. My eyes scanned the digital document, and my blood instantly turned to ice. The alert was for a newly initiated loan application in the amount of $1.5 million. The applicants listed on the digital file were Spencer Kensington and Chloe Williams. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scrolled down to the collateral section of the application. They were using a property to secure the massive high-interest loan. I stared at the address listed on the screen. It was my parents' fully paid-off mansion. Chloe and Spencer were actively trying to mortgage the very house my parents slept in to secure $1.5 million in untraceable cash. The trap was set, and my toxic family was walking right into it. Completely blindly. Blindly, Spencer clearly realized he was out of time and options. His fake technology company was already dead in the water, so he decided to steal the roof right over their heads. He had brainwashed Chloe into committing massive real estate fraud against our own parents just to keep his pathetic illusion of wealth alive for a few more weeks. I sat back in my leather office chair and let out a low, cold laugh. The game had just changed entirely, and I smiled. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed the direct line to the chief financial officer of the shadow banking subsidiary my firm had just acquired. I did not bother with any pleasantries. I told him I needed the raw file for the Kensington loan application sent to my encrypted email server within the next 60 seconds. I sat back and watched my inbox waiting for the confirmation. A moment later, the file appeared on my screen. I opened the digital folder and began scrolling through the scanned documents. It was a masterpiece of absolute sheer stupidity. Chloe and Spencer had submitted a formal request for a $1.5 million bridge loan. They were using my parents' fully paid-off mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city as the sole collateral. I zoomed in on the signature page at the bottom of the property deed transfer. Richard and Patricia Williams were signed in perfectly looped cursive ink. I knew my parents' handwriting intimately. I had spent my entire childhood forging my mother's signature on permission slips because she was always too busy at the country club to sign them herself. The signatures on this deed were completely fake. Chloe had forged our parents' names to hand over the only tangible asset they had left in the world. She was willing to steal the roof right over their heads just to hand a white con artist a massive pile of cash to save his fraudulent tech company. The level of delusion was almost hard to comprehend. She was so obsessed with maintaining the illusion of wealth that she was actively participating in massive real estate fraud. She truly believed that Spencer was just going through a temporary rough patch and that this money would fix everything. She thought she was saving her old money fairy tale. Instead, she was handing him the keys to our family home so he could burn it down. I printed the entire loan application and called my personal attorney Elias into my office. I tossed the thick stack of papers across the desk and told him to review the signatures and the collateral terms. Elias was a ruthless corporate lawyer who had seen every type of financial crime imaginable during his decades in the industry, but even he looked slightly pale as he read through the mortgage documents. He looked up at me and pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He confirmed that this was textbook wire fraud and grand larceny. He told me that Spencer was clearly using Chloe as a disposable pawn in his game. Elias explained that when the loan inevitably defaulted and the bank came looking for their money, Chloe would be the one facing federal prison time for forging the property deeds, while Spencer could easily claim he had no idea the signatures were fake. Elias leaned forward and laced his fingers together, resting his arms on my mahogany desk. He told me I had a very serious decision to make. He advised me that the standard legal and moral protocol would be to immediately notify Richard and Patricia about the fraudulent loan application. He said if I warned them right now, they could freeze the property title and file a police report against Spencer before the bank dispersed the $1.5 million into his account. They could stop the transaction and save their home. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling city skyline. The afternoon sun was reflecting off the glass buildings, but I felt entirely cold inside. I thought about my parents sitting on the terrace of their exclusive country club just a few hours ago. I remembered the absolute disgust in my mother's eyes when she slapped the Federal Bureau of Investigation dossier out of my hands. I remembered my father pointing his finger at my face, calling me a bitter, jealous spinster who was trying to ruin my sister's upper-class marriage because I could not find a man of my own. They had actively chosen a white scammer over their own black daughter. They had banned me from their lives and their homes simply to protect a man who was actively robbing them blind. They worshipped the aesthetic of his whiteness and his fake pedigree so much that they threw away the child who had actually funded their entire existence. I turned back to Elias and slowly shook my head. I told him I was not going to warn them. I told him they had made their bed and now they were going to lose it entirely. I explained that if I warned them, Patricia would simply find a way to blame me for the entire situation. She would probably claim I fabricated the loan documents just to cause drama and ruin Chloe's reputation. Richard would likely defend Spencer and say it was just a misunderstanding. They wanted to live in a fantasy world of old money and high society so badly that they refused to see the truth. So I was going to let them sign their own financial death warrant. Elias nodded slowly, understanding the absolute depth of my resolve. He had worked with me long enough to know that when I made a decision, I never backed down. He asked me what my actual plan was since he knew I was clearly not going to just sit back and watch the destruction happen without taking control of the board. I smiled a slow, calculating smile and walked back to my desk. I tapped the digital logo of the lending company on my monitor. I told Elias that the predatory shadow bank processing Spencer's loan was called Apex Financial. It was a relatively small firm that specialized in high-interest short-term loans for desperate people who could not get traditional bank approval. I reminded Elias that my venture capital firm had quietly purchased a controlling majority stake in Apex Financial just 3 weeks ago as part of a larger corporate acquisition portfolio. Spencer and Chloe had no idea they were literally applying for a loan from a company that I owned and controlled. I instructed Elias to set up a blind shell corporation immediately. I told him I wanted complete and total anonymity, so my name would not appear on any of the official banking documents. I then contacted the senior loan officers at Apex Financial and gave them a direct executive order. I told them to approve Spencer's loan application without any further verification delays or signature checks. I told them to fast-track the $1.5 million disbursement directly into his personal checking account by the end of the business day. But I added one crucial condition to the transaction. The exact moment the loan was fully executed and the Buckhead mansion was officially listed as collateral, my anonymous shell corporation was going to purchase that specific debt package directly from the bank. It took less than 48 hours for the entire legal maneuver to be completed. Spencer received his money thinking he had just pulled off the heist of the century. He believed he had successfully stolen my parents' house to fund his fake lifestyle and pay off his angry investors. He had absolutely no idea that I had just bought his debt from the bank. I was now the sole legal lien holder of the massive Buckhead mansion, the sprawling custom-built estate that Patricia and Richard prized above their own children now belonged to me. The house where I was told I was nothing but the ugly workhorse, the property they had just permanently banned me from visiting. It all legally belonged to me now. If Spencer missed a single payment on that predatory loan, I had the absolute legal authority to foreclose on the property and evict my entire family with a simple 48-hour notice. I held the physical property deed in my hands, feeling the heavy, high-quality paper between my fingers. It was the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, and I was going to wait for the absolute perfect moment to use it. A few weeks passed in total silence. My parents were completely oblivious to the fact that they no longer owned their home. Chloe was likely floating on a cloud of extreme delusion, thinking her husband was a brilliant businessman who had just secured massive funding. They were carrying on with their country club lunches and their fake high society lives, entirely unaware that a massive wrecking ball was swinging directly toward their fragile glass house. I spent those weeks focusing on my firm, expanding my portfolio, and watching the surveillance reports on Spencer's bank accounts. He was burning through the $1.5 million at an astonishing rate. He was paying off aggressive previous investors who were threatening to sue him and buying expensive luxury items to maintain his wealthy aesthetic for Chloe's social media accounts. He was digging his own grave deeper and deeper with every single transaction he made. Then the final piece of the puzzle fell right into my lap on a quiet Tuesday morning. My assistant brought my morning mail and handed me a thick, glossy envelope with heavy gold foil lettering. It was an expensive invitation that had been sent to my venture capital firm rather than to me personally. The event organizers obviously wanted to attract high-net-worth investors and simply sent invites to every major investment firm in the Atlanta area, not realizing I was the chief executive officer of this specific group. I opened the pristine white envelope and pulled out a heavy cardstock invitation. Chloe and Spencer were hosting a massive charity investment gala at the most exclusive country club in the city. The invitation boasted that Spencer was unveiling the next phase of his revolutionary tech startup. It invited the elite Black Society of Atlanta to invest a minimum of $100,000 each to join his visionary journey. The audacity of the event was absolutely breathtaking. He was using the stolen money from my parents' house to fund a lavish high-end party solely to scam even more people in my own community. He wanted to bleed the wealthy Black elite dry, and my parents were proudly standing right beside him, letting him use their hard-earned social connections to gather his vulnerable victims into one room. But the most enraging part of the delivery was the vicious handwritten note Chloe had somehow managed to slip inside the envelope before it was mailed out. She must have realized the invitation was going to my firm and decided to be as petty and cruel as possible. The note was written in her looping signature handwriting. It said she and Spencer were planning to publicly announce my official exclusion from the family during the opening toast of the evening. She wrote that they were going to formally distance themselves from my toxic and ghetto behavior to protect their elite reputation moving forward. They wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire city, making sure every prominent business leader and socialite knew I was a pariah who had been rejected by my own flesh and blood. They thought they had won the war. They thought they were rich, powerful, and totally untouchable. They felt so incredibly secure in their stolen castle that they were practically begging for me to watch them celebrate their victory. My mother probably thought she had finally secured her permanent place in the upper echelon of society, alongside her white son-in-law. My father probably thought he was finally rid of his disappointing workhorse daughter who always ruined their aesthetic. And Chloe truly thought she had outsmarted everyone by snagging a wealthy husband who was going to elevate her to billionaire status and give her the life she deserved without ever having to work a single day for it. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. They had no idea that I was already holding the match that would burn their entire fake empire to the bare ground. I folded the beautiful gold foil invitation carefully and slipped it into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. I called my assistant back into the office and told her to clear my entire schedule for the night of the charity gala. I told her to contact my personal stylist immediately because I needed a custom designer suit that screamed absolute power, dominance, and intimidation. I was not just going to politely attend their little charity event to watch from the sidelines. I was going to crash their perfect upscale party, take over the main stage, and execute the most brutal public financial dismantling the city of Atlanta had ever witnessed. The days leading up to the charity investment gala were surprisingly quiet on my end, but the streets of Atlanta, elite black society, were buzzing with pure absolute poison. Patricia and Chloe had realized that they could no longer extract money from me, so they immediately pivoted to the only other currency they understood, which was character assassination. They launched a highly coordinated and vicious smear campaign across every single country club dining room and upscale salon in the metropolitan area. Patricia was a master at the art of the Southern Whisper campaign. She began organizing exclusive luncheons with the wives of prominent doctors and lawyers specifically to control the narrative about the disastrous wedding reception. I heard from my own private network of informants of crab cakes and mimosa glasses. She would dab her eyes with a linen napkin and tell her wealthy friends that the heavy burden of corporate life had finally broken my mind. She claimed that I had suffered a massive psychotic break on the night of Chloe's wedding, and that my refusal to pay the catering bill was actually a symptom of severe mental instability. She spun a beautifully tragic tale of a mother desperately trying to get her eldest daughter into psychiatric care while shielding her youngest daughter from the trauma of it all. Patricia told everyone who would listen that I was not only losing my mind, but that I was also secretly bankrupt. She claimed that my venture capital firm was a sham and that I had blown all my money on reckless investments. Chloe took the smear campaign straight to the digital world. She spent her days posting tearful videos on her social media platforms, talking vaguely about the pain of cutting off toxic family members. She never mentioned my name directly, but she left just enough clues for her thousands of followers to piece it together. She posted long paragraphs about protecting her peace and building a beautiful new life with her billionaire husband. Despite the jealousy of negative people who tried to drag them down, she framed herself as the ultimate victim, an innocent bride whose perfect day was nearly ruined by a bitter, unstable woman. The sheer manipulation of it was textbook narcissism. They were proactively destroying my reputation to ensure that when their financial collapse finally happened, nobody in the Atlanta upper class would believe a single word I said. For a while, I let them have their fun. I sat in my office and simply watched the spectacle unfold. But the toxicity of their country club gossip eventually began to bleed into my professional life. The world of high finance is incredibly small, and reputation is everything. Two of my minor investors, older men who spent more time on the golf course with my father's friends than they did reading actual financial reports, scheduled emergency meetings with me. They sat in my boardroom shifting, uncomfortably in their expensive suits, and told me they wanted to quietly pull their capital from my fund. They used polite corporate language about reallocating their assets, but I knew exactly why they were leaving. They had heard the whispers. Patricia and Richard were spreading, and they were spooked by the rumors of my supposed financial instability. I did not argue with them. I did not try to convince them to stay. I simply smiled, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and signed their release forms without a single second of hesitation. I knew that within a month, they would be begging to get back into my portfolio once they saw what I was about to do. But for now, I let them walk away, taking their money with them. It was a minor professional hit, but it proved exactly how dangerous my parents' commitment to their lies had become. They were willing to actively damage my business and my livelihood just to protect the fragile ego of their white scammer son-in-law. The absolute peak of their delusion arrived in my private inbox. Late on a Thursday evening, I was reviewing the final legal maneuvers for the property foreclosure when a new email notification popped up on my encrypted server. It was from Spencer. He had used a secure email service, probably thinking it made him look like a high-level tech executive, but my security team traced the IP address back to my parents' mansion in less than 3 minutes. I clicked open the message and read the short paragraph he had sent. It was dripping with the kind of unearned arrogance that only a mediocre man could possess. "Leave my wife's family alone. Jada," he wrote, "your little stunt at the wedding was pathetic and everyone sees right through you. You are completely out of your league here. Focus on saving your failing business before you try to mess with mine. Do not contact Patricia or Richard again. I read the email 3 times, letting the sheer audacity of his words sink deep into my bones. A man who was currently $5 million in debt, a man who had to trick his new wife into forging property deeds just to secure a predatory loan to avoid federal prison, was sitting in the very house that I now legally owned, telling me that I was out of my league. The absolute entitlement was staggering. He truly believed that, because he projected an image of white old money, he was inherently smarter and more powerful than a self-made black woman who had literally built an empire from the ground up. He thought he had won because my family chose him over me. He thought he had successfully neutralized the only threat to his massive Ponzi scheme. I did not reply to his email. I did not retaliate against my mother's rumors or my sister's social media posts. I embraced the total silence of a predator waiting in the tall grass. I knew that the loudest person in the room was usually the weakest. And right now, my family was making an incredible amount of noise to cover up the fact that they were completely bankrupt, both financially and morally. I let them get extremely comfortable in their false victory while I meticulously prepared for the charity investment gala. I instructed Maya and my legal team to purchase a premium VIP table at Spencer's upcoming gala. We did not use my name or the name of my venture capital firm. We used one of our anonymous offshore shell corporations, a completely untraceable entity that specialized in international tech investments. We wired the $50,000 donation directly to Spencer's fraudulent business account to secure the table the moment the funds cleared. Maya confirmed that Spencer immediately used $30,000 of that exact donation to pay off a civil court judgment in Delaware. He was literally using the money I sent him for his fake charity event to keep himself out of jail for his previous scams. He was so desperate for cash that he eagerly accepted a massive donation from a faceless foreign entity without doing a single background check on where the money was actually coming from. With my access to the gala firmly secured, I turned my attention to my armor for the evening. I left my office and drove to an exclusive private boutique in the high-end retail district of Atlanta. I had a scheduled fitting for a custom Tom Ford suit I had commissioned weeks ago. I stood in front of the massive three-way mirrors while the master tailor carefully adjusted the hem of the trousers. The suit was an incredibly deep, rich shade of crimson red. It was bold, aggressive, and completely unapologetic. The jacket was tailored to absolute perfection, featuring sharp, aggressive shoulder pads that commanded authority. The moment you looked at them, it was not a suit designed for blending in or playing the polite corporate executive. It was a suit designed for walking into a room and absolutely dominating the space without having to utter a single word. I paired it with a black silk blouse and a pair of classic Christian Louboutin stilettos that sounded like weapons when they hit the floor. The days ticked down to the night of the gala, and the anticipation in my chest felt like coiled electricity. I spent the final 48 hours finalizing the massive stack of legal documents that would serve as the final nails in their collective coffins. I had the complete financial autopsy of Spencer's Ponzi scheme printed on heavy premium paper. I had the clear evidence of the forged signatures on my parents' property, deed authenticated and bound. I had the active federal subpoenas regarding Spencer's wire fraud copied and highlighted, and most importantly, I had the official 48-hour eviction notice for the Buckhead mansion signed, sealed, and ready for delivery. When the night of the charity investment gala finally arrived, the air outside was thick with the humid Georgia heat. I stood in the foyer of my penthouse, looking at my reflection in the dark glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The crimson Tom Ford suit fit like a second skin. I looked exactly like the billionaire CEO. My family was so desperately trying to pretend I was not. I gathered the thick black leather portfolio containing the documents and took the private elevator down to the secure, underground garage. My driver was waiting beside my black Maybach. The engine purring softly in the quiet, cavernous space. He opened the heavy rear door for me, and I slid into the luxurious leather back seat. The cabin of the Maybach was completely silent, insulated from the noise of the city. I placed the black leather portfolio on the empty seat beside me and smoothed the crimson fabric over my knees. The driver looked at me through the rearview mirror asking if we were heading to the country club. I looked out the tinted window at the glowing skyline of Atlanta, the city where I had shed blood to build my name, the city where my family had just spent weeks trying to destroy it. I rested my hand on top of the portfolio, feeling the weight of the absolute destruction contained within those pages. The time for silence was officially over. The time for paying their bills and protecting their fragile egos was done. Yes, I told my driver. My voice cold and perfectly steady. Time to burn the house down. The heavy wheels of my Maybach crunched softly against the pristine white gravel of the country club driveway. I looked out the tinted window and watched the valet attendants rushing to open doors for the arriving guests. The building itself was a sprawling colonial estate with massive white pillars and brilliant lights that illuminated the manicured lawns. This was the absolute epicenter of Atlanta high society. This was the exact place where my parents had spent decades trying to buy their way into relevance. Tonight, it would be the graveyard of their social ambitions. My driver pulled the vehicle right up to the red carpet that had been rolled out for Spencer's fake charity gala. Before the valet could even reach my door, my personal security detail stepped out of the trailing sport utility vehicle and opened it for me. I stepped out into the warm, humid night air. My crimson Tom Ford suit felt like armor against my skin. The sharp, aggressive cut of the fabric commanded immediate attention from everyone standing near the entrance. I adjusted my cuffs and waited for the rest of my team to assemble. Elias, my ruthless corporate attorney, stepped out of the vehicle behind me, holding a heavy black briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my family. But Elias was not the only person joining me tonight. I had called in the ultimate heavy artillery, two of the most powerful and intimidating venture capital billionaires in the entire country had flown into Atlanta specifically to stand by my side. Their names were Harrison and Sterling. They were older black men who had built massive, unshakable empires in the real estate and technology sectors. They were my genuine mentors. They were the men who had taught me how to navigate the vicious world of high finance without ever compromising my integrity. They possessed the kind of quiet, absolute generational wealth that Patricia and Richard could only dream of touching. They did not wear flashy logos or drive rented sports cars. Their power radiated from their mere presence. I had briefed Harrison and Sterling on the entire situation regarding Spencer's Ponzi scheme and my parents' blind complicity. They were utterly disgusted by the sheer audacity of a broke white scammer trying to steal from black investors using my family as his Trojan horse. They had agreed to escort me into the gala, not just to support their top protege, but to personally ensure that Spencer did not walk out of that room with a single dime of stolen capital. We walked up the wide marble steps of the country club as a united, impenetrable front. The sharp click of my stilettos echoed loudly, cutting through the polite murmurs of the wealthy guests lingering by the entrance. As we reached the massive carved wooden doors, I spotted her. Patricia was standing in the grand foyer holding a crystal flute of champagne and playing the role of the ultimate society matriarch. She was wearing a heavily beaded silver gown that looked entirely too restrictive. She was laughing and touching the arms of the wealthy doctors and lawyers she had spent weeks lying to about my mental health. The exact moment Patricia's eyes landed on my crimson suit, her fake joyous smile completely vanished. The champagne flute in her hand tilted dangerously, spilling a few drops of expensive liquor onto the polished floor. She excused herself from the group of women she was trying to impress and marched directly toward the entrance. Her face was tight with sheer panic and furious indignation. She positioned her body squarely in the center of the double doors, trying to physically block my path into the ballroom. "Jada, what in the world are you doing here?" Patricia hissed through clenched teeth. Her eyes darted frantically around the foyer to see if anyone was watching us. "You are absolutely not on the guest list. This is a highly exclusive investment gala for Spencer's technology launch. You need to turn around and leave my site right now before I call the club security to have you dragged out." I did not say a single word. I did not even break my stride. I simply looked at her with pure, cold indifference. Before Patricia could raise her hand to signal the security guard standing near the coat check, Harrison stepped smoothly in front of me. He towered over my mother by a full foot. His expression was carved from solid granite. Patricia looked up at his face and all the color instantly drained from her cheeks. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in the Atlanta elite circle knew who Harrison was. He was a billionaire titan who sat on the board of directors for this very country club. He was the ultimate peak of the social hierarchy she worshipped. "She is my personal guest of honor," Patricia Harrison said. His voice was deep quiet and laced with a terrifying amount of authority. He did not raise his tone, but the sheer weight of his words forced my mother to take an involuntary step backward. "You will move out of her way immediately, and you will not speak to her in that disrespectful tone ever again." Patricia looked like she had just been struck by lightning. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant matriarch who had spent her entire life tearing me down was completely neutralized by a single sentence from a man she desperately wanted to impress. She physically shrank back against the heavy wooden doors, pulling her silver gown out of our way. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the daughter she had thrown away was moving in circles she could never even hope to access. We walked right past her, entering the grand ballroom without another glance in her direction. The space was overwhelmingly extravagant. Massive floral centerpieces dominated the tables and waiters circulated with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with hundreds of wealthy Black professionals who had been lured here by my family's false promises. They were entirely unaware that they were sitting inside a slaughterhouse. I moved to the back of the room, standing near the heavy velvet curtains, where I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the main stage. Elias stood to my left, clutching the briefcase. Harrison and Sterling stood behind me, forming a wall of silent intimidation. I looked at the stage and felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. Spencer was standing behind a clear acrylic podium bathed in bright theatrical lighting. He was wearing a navy blue tuxedo that looked expensive, but I knew he had likely bought it using the fraudulent loan he secured against my parents' house. Chloe was standing slightly behind him to his right. She was wearing a glittering emerald gown, clearly trying to project the image of a wealthy, supportive wife. She was beaming with intense fake pride, looking out at the crowd, as if she were a queen surveying her loyal subjects. She had absolutely no idea that she was standing next to a sinking anchor. Spencer adjusted his microphone and smiled warmly at the audience. He was a textbook sociopath playing the role of the charismatic tech visionary to absolute perfection. He began pacing across the stage using sweeping hand gestures to describe his supposedly revolutionary software algorithm. He threw out complex technical buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. He talked about synergy and blockchain integration and disruptive market scaling. He was speaking with such unearned confidence, hoping that the sheer volume of his corporate jargon would confuse the investors enough to make them open their wallets. "We are standing on the precipice of a new digital era," Spencer announced, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "My team has developed a proprietary system that will fundamentally change how global markets interact with local commerce. But to take this vision to the next level, we are opening our doors to a select group of exclusive partners tonight. We are looking for leaders who understand the value of being first. We are requiring a minimum capital commitment of $100,000 to join this historic round of funding." I watched the crowd carefully. Some of the older investors looked skeptical, but many of the younger attendees were nodding along, captivated by the illusion of his white old money aesthetic. Patricia and Richard had done their jobs perfectly. They had vouched for this scammer and convinced their wealthy network that Spencer was a guaranteed golden ticket. Spencer walked back to the center of the stage and placed both hands on the acrylic podium. He looked out over the sea of faces with a greedy, hungry shine in his eyes. His fake smile widened as he prepared to close the trap on his victims. So Spencer asked, his voice dropping to a dramatic, persuasive whisper, "Do we have any visionary investors in the room tonight, ready to change the world?" The silence in the ballroom was absolute. People were looking at each other, waiting to see who would be the first to raise their hand and commit their money. I knew this was my exact moment. The perfect fraction of a second to strike the fatal blow. I reached out and firmly grasped the arm of a passing waiter who was holding a wireless microphone intended for the upcoming question and answer session. I pulled the microphone from his hand before he could even register what was happening. I stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains and moved directly into the center aisle of the ballroom. My crimson suit caught the light, instantly drawing the eyes of every single person in the massive room. I gripped the microphone tight and raised it to my lips. My voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, slicing through the heavy silence like a sharpened blade. I have a massive investment I would love to discuss tonight. Spencer, I said, my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of any warmth. But before any money changes hands, let us take a close look at your real financials first. The sheer shock on Spencer's face was absolute poetry. He froze completely, his hands gripping the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. Chloe let out a loud, visible gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at me in total horror. The entire ballroom shifted their attention between the stage and the center aisle, trying to understand what was happening. I did not stop moving. I walked slowly down the long center aisle, flanked by my powerful mentors and my ruthless attorney, heading straight for the stage to finish exactly what my family had started. The heavy silence in the ballroom was thick enough to suffocate a person, but I breathed it in like fresh air. Every single eye in the room was locked onto my crimson suit as I made my way down the center aisle. My heels clicked against the polished hardwood floor, setting a steady, terrifying rhythm. Spencer stood completely frozen behind his clear acrylic podium, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges. His carefully crafted smile was rapidly melting off his face, revealing the panicked scammer underneath. Chloe was trembling slightly, her emerald green gown shimmering under the stage lights as she stared at me with pure venom. She truly believed I was just there to cause a petty scene. She thought I was going to throw a tantrum about being excluded from her wedding. She had absolutely no idea that I brought a financial guillotine with me. I walked with absolute purpose, flanked by the terrifying presence of Harrison and Sterling, who moved like shadow titans behind me. Their massive wealth and influence radiated through the room, causing the seated guests to part like the Red Sea. Elias walked to my left, holding the black leather briefcase that contained the raw, undeniable proof of my family's profound delusion. The distance from the back of the ballroom to the main stage felt like a triumphant parade. I looked at the faces of the wealthy black investors sitting at the VIP tables. People who had worked their entire lives to build generational wealth. People Patricia and Richard had deliberately lured into a trap just to appease their white son-in-law. I felt a fierce, protective instinct over my community. I was not just going to destroy Spencer for what he did to me. I was going to publicly execute his fraudulent empire so he could never steal from our people again. When I finally reached the front of the stage, I did not step up onto the platform. I simply stood on the floor looking up at Spencer, forcing him to look down at the black woman. He thought he could easily discard. His breathing was shallow and uneven. Beads of sweat were beginning to form on his forehead, completely ruining his pristine old money aesthetic. I raised the microphone to my lips, and the feedback whined for a fraction of a second before settling into a crystal-clear channel. I told Spencer that his pitch was incredibly moving. I told him that his vision for the future of global markets was an absolute masterpiece of corporate fiction. I asked him if he wanted to share the reality of his business model with his potential investors, or if he preferred that I do the honors. Spencer opened his mouth to speak, but his voice cracked, pitching into a pathetic, nervous squeak. He tried to signal the audio-visual technicians at the back of the room to cut my microphone, but they were already completely under my control. I did not wait for him to find his fake confidence again. I raised my left hand and gave a sharp, subtle signal to Maya, my lead investigator, who was standing in the sound booth at the very back of the ballroom. She immediately bypassed their entire presentation system. She jammed a heavily encrypted flash drive into their main server and overrode the projector system. The massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered violently for 3 seconds. The slick modern logo of Spencer's fake technology company vanished completely. The bright blue and white branding was instantly replaced by high-resolution scans of raw, unedited financial documents. The collective gasp that erupted from the hundreds of guests in the ballroom sounded like a massive wave crashing against a rocky shore. I turned my body slightly so I could look at the screens alongside the audience. The first document displayed in massive glaring detail was a certified bank statement from Spencer's primary corporate account. The account he claimed was holding millions of dollars in seed funding. The numbers on the screen were highlighted in bright, aggressive red. The total available balance was negative $4.2 million. The detailed transaction history below. The balance showed a horrifying pattern of absolute desperation. There were no deposits from tech incubators or venture capital firms. There were only massive outgoing wire transfers to offshore accounts, predatory high-interest loan payments, and aggressive overdraft fees from multiple bounced checks. He was bleeding cash at a terminal velocity, and he was using the exact same account to pay off previous investors who were threatening to sue him. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing clearly over the horrified murmurs of the crowd. I told the audience to look very closely at the screen. I explained that the man standing on the stage asking them for a minimum investment of $100,000 was currently operating a massive Ponzi scheme. I pointed out the specific lines on the bank statement, where he had used donation funds from previous charity events to settle personal civil court judgments. I told the investors that their hard-earned money was not going toward a revolutionary software algorithm. Their money was going directly into the pockets of angry creditors, just to keep Spencer out of a jail cell for a few more weeks. Spencer gripped his microphone and tried to speak over me. He stammered wildly, telling the crowd that the documents were completely fabricated. He claimed his company was the victim of a sophisticated corporate espionage attack by a jealous competitor. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive navy tuxedo looking suddenly cheap and unkempt. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign that the investors were buying his frantic excuses. But the wealthy men and women in the audience were not fools. They knew what real certified banking documents looked like. Maya clicked to the next slide, and an even more devastating document appeared on the massive screens. It was a federal subpoena from the United States Department of Justice, complete with the official government seal and a federal judge's signature. The document explicitly named Spencer Kensington as the primary target of an active multi-state wire fraud investigation. It detailed how he had systematically defrauded over 30 investors across the eastern seaboard using shell companies and falsified technology patents. The document demanded the immediate surrender of all his personal and professional assets. The sheer, undeniable weight of the federal subpoena shattered whatever tiny fraction of doubt remained in the room. The reaction from this crowd was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. The elegant high society atmosphere dissolved into absolute panic. Wealthy investors, who had literally just written checks to Spencer, began scrambling out of their seats. I watched a prominent cardiac surgeon at the front table furiously rip his check into tiny pieces and throw them onto the floor. Women in expensive gowns pulled out their cell phones, frantically calling their bank managers to place immediate stop payment orders on the wire transfers they had authorized earlier that evening. The outrage was palpable. They realized they had almost been scammed out of their generational wealth by a man who had used my parents' standing in the community to gain their blind trust. Sterling and Harrison, my billionaire mentors, stood behind me, nodding in quiet, grim approval. They crossed their massive arms over their chests, projecting an aura of absolute dominance that kept anyone from trying to intervene or stop my presentation. They were watching me dismantle a predator with flawless precision, and they were clearly proud of the ruthless executive I had become. Up on the stage, the reality of the situation was finally crashing down on Chloe. The beautiful green emerald gown she wore suddenly looked like a tragic costume. Her fairy tale world of old money and white privilege was burning to ash right in front of her eyes. But her delusion was so deeply ingrained, so fundamentally tied to her desperate need for validation, that she simply refused to accept the truth. She could not handle the fact that her perfect husband was a broke criminal. She could not process the fact that the sister she had mocked and excluded was the one holding the match. Chloe lunged forward and snatched the microphone from Spencer's trembling hand. She stepped to the very edge of the stage, pointing her finger down at me, her face contorted with hysterical rage. Tears of pure panic streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "Do not listen to her," Chloe screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing painfully through the large ballroom. "She is lying. She is a bitter, jealous spinster who hates her own family. She forged these documents because she is obsessed with ruining my happiness. My husband is a Kensington. He comes from one of the most prominent families in Connecticut. He has generational wealth. You are all just letting a crazy woman manipulate you." She was crying hysterically now, her chest heaving as she tried to defend a man who was actively destroying her life. She looked out at the audience, begging them to believe her empty words. But the guests just stared back at her with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. They saw her for exactly what she was, a foolish, vain woman who had sold out her own blood for the illusion of status. I looked up at my sister, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for her tears. She had made her choices. She had forged the property deeds. She had laughed when I was thrown out of her wedding. She had actively participated in a smear campaign to destroy my business reputation. She wanted to play a high-stakes game of social warfare, and she was furious that she was losing. I raised my own microphone to my lips, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a calm, icy breeze. I looked dead into her panicked eyes. I told her that Spencer was indeed a Kensington. I said he was a Kensington with a 420 credit score and a mountain of federal warrants. I told her the old money she was so desperately trying to protect had run out before she was even born. I asked her if she really thought a billionaire tech founder would need his new wife to illegally mortgage her parents' house just to pay for a country club party. The mention of the mortgaged house made Patricia and Richard, who were standing near the side entrance, freeze in absolute horror. But I was not quite ready to deal with them. Yet my focus remained entirely on the pathetic man sweating on the stage. Spencer finally realized that the charade was completely over. There was no charming his way out of a federal subpoena, displayed on a 20-foot screen. There was no manipulating a room full of furious investors who were actively dialing their attorneys. He looked down at me and saw the absolute unrelenting ruin in my eyes. He knew that I had outsmarted him on every single level. He knew that my venture capital firm had the resources to crush him into dust and keep him buried forever. The survival instinct of a cornered rat finally kicked in the facade of the polished prep school. Gentleman completely evaporated, leaving only the cowardly scammer behind. He realized that federal agents were likely already on their way to the country club, given the public nature of the event and the active warrants against him. He needed to run. Spencer dropped his microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback. He did not look at the crowd. He did not try to offer an explanation. He did not even look at his new wife, the woman who had sacrificed her entire family just to elevate his status. He simply turned around and physically shoved Chloe out of his way to get to the stairs. Chloe stumbled backward in her high heels, her emerald dress catching under her feet. She let out a sharp cry of shock as she fell hard onto the stage floor, scraping her hands and knees against the polished wood. Spencer did not stop to help her up. He did not even glance back to see if she was hurt. He sprinted down the side stairs of the stage, pushing past a confused waiter, dropping a tray of champagne glasses. He bolted directly toward the swinging double doors that led to the industrial kitchen, desperate to find a back exit out of the country club before the authorities arrived. Chloe sat on the floor of the stage, sobbing uncontrollably. Her beautiful dress ruined her dignity, completely shredded, her fairy tale shattered. She reached her hand out toward the kitchen doors, calling Spencer's name in a pathetic, desperate wail, but he was already gone, leaving her alone to face the catastrophic wreckage of their massive deception. The ballroom erupted into total chaos around me. People were shouting. Security guards were running towards the kitchen doors to chase the fleeing groom, and investors were demanding answers from the event organizers. I stood perfectly still in my crimson suit, watching my sister cry on the floor. I had just executed the most brutal financial takedown in the history of Atlanta elite society, and I had not even deployed my final weapon yet. The night was far from over, and the true cost of their betrayal was about to be paid in full. The distant wail of sirens began to pierce through the chaotic noise of the grand ballroom. At first, it was just a faint, high-pitched sound echoing over the manicured lawns of the country club, but it quickly grew louder and more aggressive. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers started reflecting violently against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the shocked faces of the Atlanta elite in alternating colors of panic and dread. The heavy double doors of the ballroom were thrown open with a loud crash, and a dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed across their backs stormed into the room. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out to secure every single exit, while their lead agent marched directly toward the stage, holding a thick stack of federal warrants. The high society guests, who had spent their entire lives desperately avoiding any association with criminal behavior, completely lost their minds. Wealthy socialites grabbed their expensive evening gowns and scrambled to get as far away from the stage as possible. They pushed past each other, trying to flee the room, treating my family like they were a highly contagious disease. The very people my parents had worshipped, the old money crowd they had sacrificed my college fund to impress, were now looking at them with pure, unadulterated disgust. Patricia and Richard finally broke out of their frozen state of shock. They rushed down the center aisle, pushing past the terrified investors to reach the stage. Their faces were absolute masks of horror and desperate denial. But instead of going to comfort Chloe, who was still sobbing hysterically on the wooden floor, they turned their absolute fury directly onto me. Patricia scrambled up the stage stairs, her silver-beaded gown catching on the steps. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my face and screamed that I had planned this entire raid just to destroy them. She yelled that I had called the federal authorities to ruin their pristine reputation in front of the most powerful people in the city. She claimed I was a vindictive monster who could not stand to see my family thrive in elite circles I could not access. Richard stepped up right beside her, his breathing heavy and erratic. His tuxedo was rumpled and his eyes were wide with a sickening mixture of anger and absolute delusion. He looked at me and demanded that I fix the situation immediately. He ordered me to take out my checkbook and pay off whatever debts Spencer owed right then and there. He yelled that I had more than enough capital in my venture capital firm to cover a $5 million deficit, and that it was my duty as his daughter to protect the family name from federal prosecution. He told me to walk over to the lead federal agent and negotiate a financial settlement, so the police would leave his white son-in-law alone and restore the dignity of their investment gala. They genuinely believed that my money was just an endless safety net, designed to catch them every single time they willingly jumped off a cliff. I looked at my parents standing on the stage, demanding that I bail out a fugitive scammer who had deliberately excluded me from his wedding. I let out a slow, dark laugh that echoed through my microphone, causing the remaining guests in the room to fall completely silent. I looked Richard dead in the eyes and told him that federal wire fraud was not a country club bar tab that could simply be paid off with a black card. I told him the federal government was not interested in my venture capital funds. They were interested in putting Spencer Kensington in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. I looked at Patricia and told her that I did not call the authorities tonight. I told her Spencer had called this destruction upon himself the exact moment he decided to steal from the wrong people. Patricia began to weep loudly, begging me to do something, anything to save their social standing. She cried that they would be ruined, that nobody in their elite black circle would ever speak to them again if Spencer was arrested. I told her that Spencer being arrested was actually the absolute least of her problems right now. I signaled to Elias, my ruthless attorney, who stepped forward and handed me the heavy black leather portfolio. I unzipped the portfolio and pulled out the thick manila folder containing the most devastating documents of the entire night. I held it up so the bright stage lights caught the stark white paper. I told my parents that they needed to stop worrying about Spencer's debts because Spencer had already spent their money. Richard frowned deeply, his brow furrowing in profound confusion. He stammered that they had not given Spencer any money. He claimed all their assets were tied up in their estate and their retirement funds, and they had only paid for the wedding. I took 2 steps forward and threw the manila folder directly onto the wooden floor of the stage. It landed with a heavy thud right between Richard's expensive leather shoes and Chloe's ruined emerald gown. I told them to open the folder. I told them to look at the very first page of the legal documents inside. Richard slowly reached down with trembling hands and picked up the folder. He opened it and stared at the pages. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the complex legal jargon. I spoke into the microphone, making sure my voice was crystal clear for everyone in the room to hear. I explained that earlier this week, their perfect precious daughter Chloe had forged both of their signatures on a series of real estate transfer documents. I told them Chloe had illegally handed over the deed to their fully paid-off Buckhead mansion to secure a predatory bridge loan for $1.5 million. The collective gasp from the remaining guests was deafening. The very people Patricia and Richard had tried to impress were now witnessing the ultimate humiliation of a family destroying itself from the inside out. I continued speaking, my voice devoid of any pity or hesitation. I told my parents that Chloe had willingly mortgaged the roof right over their heads just to hand a white scammer a massive pile of untraceable cash. I explained that Spencer used a tiny fraction of their stolen house money to rent this ballroom and buy the cheap champagne everyone was drinking just to fund this fake charity gala. He took the rest of the $1.5 million and ran out the kitchen door, leaving them to face the federal agents completely alone. Richard stared at the forged signatures on the property deed, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal short-circuited his brain. The golden child he had worshipped, the daughter he had sacrificed my college fund to protect, had literally sold his home to a con artist right out from under him. Richard let out a sudden, sharp gasp. He dropped the folder, letting the papers scatter all over the stage. He clutched his chest with both hands, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. His knees gave out and he collapsed onto the wooden floor, struggling to pull air into his lungs. Patricia let out a blood-curdling scream, but she did not rush to comfort her husband, who was gasping on the floor. Instead, she turned her absolute terrifying wrath directly onto Chloe. Patricia dropped to her knees on the stage, grabbing Chloe by the shoulders of her ruined emerald gown, and began shaking her violently. Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know if it was true. She yelled, asking how Chloe could be so incredibly stupid, how she could betray her own flesh and blood for a broke criminal who abandoned her. The second things got difficult. Chloe could not even form a coherent sentence. She was hyperventilating wildly, gasping for air as tears and makeup ran down her face in thick, ugly rivers. She kept shaking her head back and forth, choking on her own sobs, completely incapable of defending herself against the undeniable proof of her massive felony. She had destroyed her family for a man who did not even love her enough to help her off the floor when he ran. The scene on the stage was a masterpiece of absolute catastrophic ruin. The federal agents were moving closer to the platform, securing the evidence left on the podium, while my father clutched his chest on the ground and my mother violently shook my sobbing sister. The elite high society guests were whispering in horrified tones, watching the utter destruction of the Williams family name. I stood perfectly still in my crimson suit, watching the people who had abused me for 3 decades finally experience the exact same feeling of total, helpless despair they had inflicted upon me for my entire life. The house of cards had completely collapsed, crushing them under the weight of their own blinding vanity. But the night was not over. I looked down at the weeping, broken family at my feet, and I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the crisp, heavy paper of the final legal document. I had not even delivered the killing blow yet, and I was about to make sure they had absolutely nothing left. Richard was still gasping for air on the polished wooden floor of the stage, his hands clutching the fabric of his expensive tuxedo shirt. His face was a terrifying shade of gray, and his eyes were wide with a sickening mixture of anger and absolute delusion. He looked completely pathetic, a man who had built his entire identity around projecting wealth and superiority, now reduced to a trembling mess on the ground. Patricia had stopped shaking Chloe and was now just staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She looked like a wild animal that had finally realized it was caught in a trap with no way out. The heavy layers of expensive foundation and setting powder on her face were completely ruined by her tears streaming down and leaving ugly dark tracks of mascara across her cheeks. The federal agents were moving methodically through the ballroom, securing the exits and coordinating their search for Spencer. But the lead agent had paused near the edge of the stage. He was watching our family dynamic unfold, completely aware that the financial crime they were investigating was deeply intertwined with the personal destruction happening right in front of him. The high society guests, the doctors and lawyers and real estate magnates that my parents had worshipped for decades, were standing perfectly still. They were holding their collective breath, waiting to see what I was going to do next. These were the people Patricia had tried to impress by calling me a bitter spinster and a mental case. Now those same people were looking at her with absolute revulsion. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to where my father was kneeling. My crimson suit felt like royal armor. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man who had called me an ugly workhorse. I did not feel a single shred of remorse for the woman who had banned me from her home to protect a white con artist. Patricia looked up at me, and her face twisted into a pathetic mask of desperation. She reached her hand out toward my ankle, but she did not dare touch the fabric of my suit. She begged me to fix it. Her voice was hoarse and broken as she pleaded with me to use my venture capital firm to pay off the bank. She cried that they would lose everything if the bank foreclosed on the mansion. She told me that I had to save them because we were a black family, and we had to stick together against the world. The sheer hypocrisy of her words almost made me laugh out loud. She was invoking the concept of black solidarity and family loyalty only after her fake white old money savior had literally robbed her blind and left her for dead on a public stage. I looked down at Patricia and shook my head slowly. I told her that her sudden, desperate plea for family loyalty was about 32 years too late. I told her that I could not pay off the predatory loan that Chloe had taken out because the money was already gone. It had been spent on offshore wire transfers and fake charity gala decorations. I told her that even if I wanted to save her, which I absolutely did not, it was financially impossible to reverse the massive fraud her golden child had committed. Patricia let out a loud, tragic wail, burying her face in her hands. But I told her that she did not need to worry about the faceless shadow bank coming to collect the debt. I took another step forward, closing the distance between me and my trembling sister. Chloe was hyperventilating so hard she could barely keep her eyes open. Her beautiful emerald gown was stained with tears and sweat. I looked dead into Chloe's eyes, and I asked her if she really thought a massive corporate bridge loan was approved and disbursed in 48 hours without a single background check just because of her charming smile. I asked her if she really believed she had outsmarted the entire financial system by forging a couple of signatures on a property deed I watched. The confusion mixed with the sheer terror on her face. She was shaking her head, trying to back away from me, but there was nowhere left to run. I turned my gaze back to my parents, and I told them the truth. I told them that the sketchy lending company Chloe had used to mortgage their home was a tiny subsidiary of a larger financial institution. I told them that my venture capital firm had just acquired that exact institution a few weeks ago. I paused, letting the heavy silence wrap around their throats and squeeze. I told them the best part of this entire disaster was that the shadow bank Chloe sold their house to was a bank that I exclusively owned. I told them that I was the one who bought their debt. I was the one holding the strings to their entire existence. Richard stopped gasping and simply froze. All the air left his lungs in one sharp wheeze. Patricia let out a sound that was halfway between a sob and a scream. She realized instantly what my words meant, realized that the daughter she had treated like garbage for her entire life was now the supreme ruler of her financial universe. Chloe shrank back against the wooden floor, trying to press herself away from me, as if I were a literal fire burning her skin. She started babbling uncontrollably, blaming Spencer, saying he forced her to do it, claiming she had no idea the house would actually be at risk. But nobody was listening to her pathetic excuses. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out the crisp, legal document I had meticulously prepared. I did not hand it to them, I simply held it up, so the bright stage lights illuminated the bold black text at the top of the page. I told them this was not a bailout or a negotiation. I told them it was a formal 48-hour eviction notice. I explained with cold mechanical precision that because the initial terms of the predatory loan had already been violated by Spencer's flight from federal authorities, the property was now in immediate default. I read the exact address of their sprawling luxury estate out loud into the microphone, making sure every single person in the room knew exactly which property was being seized. I told my parents that I legally owned the deed to the mansion they lived in. I told them I owned the house they had proudly banned me from. I told them I owned the very roof over their heads, and I was officially foreclosing on the property tonight. My voice carried through the silent ballroom, reaching the ears of every single wealthy guest who had stayed to watch the spectacle. I told Patricia and Richard that they had exactly 48 hours to pack up their cheap country club memberships, their fake designer clothes, and their delusions of grandeur and get off my property. I told them that if they left a single scratch on the marble floors or took a single fixture that belonged to the house, I would personally sue them for property damage and drain whatever tiny fraction of their retirement funds they had left. I looked at Chloe, who was practically convulsing on the floor, and I told her she had better start packing too, because she was no longer welcome in my house either. I told her she could go live in a cardboard box with her old money husband. For all I cared, the absolute destruction of their lives was finally complete. I had taken every single thing they valued. I took their money, I took their home, and I took their precious social standing. I turned my gaze away from my sobbing family and looked out at the audience. The high society guests, the elite black professionals of Atlanta were whispering to each other in total horror and complete disgust, but they were not disgusted with me. They were disgusted with Patricia and Richard. They had heard every word of my public execution. They knew that my parents had actively chosen to protect a white scammer who was actively stealing from their own community. They knew that Chloe had committed massive real estate fraud against her own parents just to fund a fake charity gala. I saw the president of the country club standing near the back doors, his face completely dark with anger. I knew without a doubt that he would be permanently revoking my parents' membership. First thing in the morning, I saw women who had been drinking mimosas with Patricia just yesterday, literally turning their backs to the stage, refusing to even look at her. My parents' social standing was permanently and irrevocably obliterated. There would be no more invitations to exclusive luncheons. There would be no more seats at the country club dining room. There would be no more bragging about their perfect upper-class life. They were officially outcasts. They would be known forever as the foolish, arrogant family who threw away a self-made billionaire daughter for a broke con artist who left them homeless and disgraced. I did not wait for Patricia to formulate another pathetic excuse. I did not wait for Richard to catch his breath and try to assert his non-existent parental authority. I simply turned my back on them. I left the manila folder and the forged property deeds scattered on the floor next to my sister's ruined dress. I walked to the edge of the stage and stepped down onto the main floor. Elias Harrison and Sterling fell into step right beside me, forming a protective shield of pure wealth and power as we walked back up the center aisle. The crowd parted for us with genuine respect. They looked at me not as a bitter spinster, but as a ruthless, brilliant executive who had just successfully executed the most flawless financial takedown in the history of the city. The federal agents were moving past us, heading directly toward the stage. The lead agent gave me a brief, sharp nod of acknowledgement as we crossed paths. He knew my firm had provided the financial documentation that made this entire raid possible. I heard him calling out Chloe's name, loudly informing her that she was being detained for questioning regarding massive mortgage fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Chloe began to scream for our mother, but Patricia was too busy sobbing over her lost mansion to even comfort her golden child. The sound of Chloe's hysterical crying and the clinking of metal handcuffs faded into the background. As I reached the heavy double doors of the ballroom, I pushed them open and stepped out into the grand foyer, leaving the wreckage of my toxic family completely behind me. The warm, humid Atlanta night air washed over me as I walked down the marble steps toward my waiting Maybach. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound, absolute peace. The invisible chains of family obligation that had suffocated me for 32 years were finally broken. I had burned their fake empire to the ground, and I was walking away without a single burn mark on my crimson suit. As my driver opened the rear door for me, I looked back at the grand colonial columns of the country club. One last time I thought about the wedding invitation that had intentionally left off my name. I thought about the nasty little remarks about how my corporate vibe did not fit their elegant aesthetic. They were absolutely right. My vibe was never meant to fit into their shallow, fragile world of pretend wealth. My vibe was built for hostile takeovers and corporate conquests. They wanted to play socialite games with a woman who played financial chess for a living, and they had lost the board entirely. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, and the heavy door closed with a solid, comforting thud, shutting out the distant wail of the police sirens entirely. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the chilled compartment and let my head rest against the soft headrest. The empire I had built was finally free from the leeches who had drained it for so long. I had no idea what Patricia and Richard would do when the 48 hours ran out, and frankly, it was no longer my problem to solve. They could finally experience the very real, very harsh world that they had forced me to navigate alone when I was just a struggling college student. They were about to learn exactly how cold reality could be when you have no money, no status, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly down the long, winding driveway. My phone remained completely silent. My security team had already blocked every single contact associated with my former family. There would be no more midnight ambushes, no more demanding text messages, no more toxic guilt trips. There was only the quiet hum of the engine and the beautiful glowing skyline of the city I had conquered. I closed my eyes and let the absolute silence wash over me, preparing for the final chapter of this glorious destruction. Exactly. 48 hours later, the digital clock on my sleek mahogany desk flipped to 3 in the afternoon, confirming that the absolute deadline I had given them had officially expired. For 2 entire days, I had sat in my glass corner office and watched the spectacular, catastrophic fallout of my country club execution dominate the local Atlanta news cycle. The sheer magnitude of the destruction was almost difficult to fully comprehend, even for me. Spencer was still on the run, having completely vanished into the wind, leaving a massive trail of furious, wealthy investors and active federal warrants in his wake. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had raided his empty, fraudulent offices downtown, seizing boxes of fake financial documents and confirming to the public that his tech startup was nothing but a predatory illusion. Chloe had spent a horrifying, deeply humiliating night in a sterile holding cell, still wearing her ruined emerald green wedding reception gown. The police had detained her at the country club for her direct involvement in the forged property deeds and the massive wire fraud conspiracy. Richard had been forced to desperately liquidate the very last fraction of his retirement savings just to post her exorbitant bail the following morning. The media coverage across the city was absolutely merciless, highlighting how a supposedly prominent upper-class family had been completely duped by a broke white con artist. The elite black community of Atlanta, the doctors, lawyers, and real estate magnates that my parents had worshipped for decades entirely, excommunicated them overnight. The prestigious country club had revoked their membership via a public email blast sent to every single member, effectively cementing their status as ultimate social pariahs. They were no longer the proud, wealthy socialites looking down on everyone else. They were a highly publicized cautionary tale. True to my word, my legal team had executed the eviction notice with flawless precision. The local sheriff's department had arrived at the sprawling Buckhead mansion that morning and physically locked them out of the property. They had lost absolutely everything: their money, their home, their fake pedigree, and their precious social standing. A soft knock on my heavy glass door pulled me from my thoughts. My lead security director stepped into my office, his expression completely unreadable but intensely professional. He informed me that 3 individuals matching the exact description of my former family were currently standing in the main lobby of the venture capital firm. They had apparently bypassed the standard strict visitor protocols by slipping through the revolving glass doors right behind a delivery courier. He told me they were refusing to leave the reception area and were aggressively demanding to speak with the chief executive officer. I did not rush to meet them. I took my time finishing a complex quarterly financial projection, saving the document, and closing my laptop. I stood up slowly, smoothing the dark, luxurious fabric of my tailored charcoal suit, ensuring my presentation was absolutely flawless. I walked out of my office and stepped into my private glass elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended smoothly, I looked through the transparent shaft at the sprawling corporate lobby below. It was a massive, sterile space designed specifically to intimidate anyone who walked through the doors. It featured cold white marble floors, soaring 30-foot ceilings, and heavily armed private security personnel stationed at every single exit. Standing right in the absolute center of this imposing corporate fortress were Patricia, Richard, and Chloe. Looking down at them from above, they looked absolutely unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant country club facade they had maintained for 30 years had been completely violently stripped away, leaving nothing but raw, desperate panic in its place. Patricia was no longer wearing her custom designer dresses or her signature heavy pearl necklaces. She wore a wrinkled beige trench coat, and her usually perfect hair was visibly unkempt and frizzy. Richard looked like he had aged 20 years in just 2 days. His shoulders were heavily slumped. His face was gray, and his eyes were darting nervously around the heavily guarded room like a trapped animal. Chloe stood between them, looking completely hollowed out and entirely broken. The smug golden child who had giggled and laughed at me for not having a seat at her $200,000 wedding was now clutching a cheap plastic suitcase with a broken wheel. They had brought all their remaining worldly possessions in 3 pathetic pieces of discount luggage. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. The bank had frozen whatever tiny accounts they had left, and nobody in their former high society circle would even answer their phone calls. The glass doors of my private elevator chimed softly and slid open. The sound echoed sharply across the quiet marble floor, instantly drawing their attention. My parents and my sister turned their heads simultaneously. The moment Patricia's eyes locked onto mine as I stepped out of the elevator, she completely abandoned whatever tiny shred of human dignity she had left. She dropped the handle of her cheap suitcase, letting it fall heavily to the floor, and actually fell to her knees, right in the middle of my corporate lobby. It was a stunning, pathetic display of ultimate manipulation. "Jada, please," she wailed, her voice cracking and echoing off the high acoustic ceilings. She crawled a few inches forward on the cold stone floor, reaching her shaking hands out toward my designer shoes, but not daring to actually touch me. "You have to help us, Jada. We have absolutely nothing left. The bank locked the doors and the police are watching our every move. You cannot do this to us. We are a black family, Jada. We have to stick together in this world. You know how hard it is for us out there. You cannot let your own flesh and blood sleep on the street. You have to save your sister from going to federal prison. Please, Jada, I am begging you." The absolute, unmitigated audacity of her using our race and our blood to beg for a financial bailout was staggering. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling completely emotionally detached from her performative sobbing. I thought about how she never talked about black solidarity when she was blindly worshiping a white con artist who was actively robbing her own community. She never cared about sticking together when she was throwing my luggage out into the freezing Chicago snow years ago, calling me a disgrace. She only remembered that we were family when her fake white savior robbed her blind, humiliated her on a public stage, and left her for dead. Chloe took a tentative, trembling step forward, tears streaming rapidly down her pale, exhausted face. She looked absolutely destroyed, stripped of all the unearned arrogance and vanity that had defined her entire miserable existence. "Jada, I am so sorry," she sobbed, her voice cracking pitifully as she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I will do anything you want me to do. I will work for you for free. I will clean your office floors every single night. I am so sorry about the wedding. I am so sorry I laughed at you and left you off the seating chart. Please do not let the federal agents put me in a jail cell. Spencer lied to me. He ruined my entire life. He used me to get to the house. You are the only one powerful enough to fix this. Please, sister, please." I looked at my sister, the beloved golden child, who had willingly forged our parents' signatures to steal their home just to impress a man who despised her. I looked at my father, who was standing silently behind them, too cowardly to even speak, too deeply ashamed to look his highly successful daughter in the eye. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. I did not feel a single drop of familial obligation pulling at my conscience. The well of empathy I had reserved for them had dried up a very long time ago. I spoke, and my voice was completely devoid of any emotion, perfectly flat and chillingly calm, echoing with the absolute authority of a woman who held all the cards. "You forgot my seat at the table when you thought you were on top," I said, my words slicing through their desperate sobbing like a surgical scalpel. "You laughed in my face when you believed your fake old money status made you completely untouchable. You wanted to sit at a luxurious table built entirely on lies, forged signatures, and stolen money. Now that you are sitting at the absolute bottom, do not expect me to build you a new one. You chose your fragile aesthetic over my loyalty. You chose a documented scammer over my blood. I am not your safety net. I am not your daughter anymore. I am just your landlord, and your lease is permanently terminated." Patricia let out a horrific wailing sound, pressing her face directly against the cold marble floor in total defeat. Richard finally stepped forward, his hands shaking as he tried to pull his weeping wife up by her arms, pulling her away from my feet. Chloe collapsed against her broken plastic suitcase, crying hysterically into her hands, knowing that her fate was now entirely in the hands of the federal justice system. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply raised my hand and signaled the head of my massive security team, who had been standing silently nearby, watching the entire pathetic interaction unfold. "Escort them off the premises," I ordered, my voice echoing with total unrelenting finality. "Make sure they take their trash with them. If they ever step foot on this property or approach any of my buildings again, you will call the police immediately and have them arrested for criminal trespassing." The massive security guards moved in immediately, their imposing frames completely blocking my family from getting any closer to me. They grabbed the cheap suitcases and began physically herding Patricia, Richard, and Chloe toward the revolving glass doors. I did not wait to watch them being pushed out onto the busy Atlanta streets. I turned my back on their desperate sobbing and their ruined lives and stepped right back into my private glass elevator. I pressed the button for the top floor, and the heavy doors slid shut, cutting off the pathetic sound of my mother's frantic begging completely. The elevator glided smoothly up the long shaft, carrying me back up to my quiet sanctuary. I stepped out onto the executive floor and walked straight into my massive corner office. The late afternoon sun was just beginning to set, casting a brilliant, vibrant golden light across the sprawling, beautiful Atlanta skyline. The city looked incredibly peaceful from this high up, far removed from the toxic chaos and the pathetic scrambling of people who cared more about a fake image than basic human integrity. I walked over to my custom crystal decanter, resting on a polished mahogany side table, and poured myself a generous measure of 50-year-old vintage bourbon. The rich amber liquid caught the golden sunlight as I swirled it gently in the heavy crystal glass. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the busy street far below. I could just barely make out three tiny, insignificant figures dragging their broken luggage down the crowded sidewalk, moving further and further away from my building until they disappeared into the deep shadows of the city completely. I pulled my phone from my tailored pocket. I opened the contact list and permanently blocked Patricia, Richard, and Chloe, ensuring they could never reach me again. I deleted their previous frantic voicemails and erased their existence from my digital world just as thoroughly and mercilessly as I had erased them from my life. I took a slow, deep sip of the incredibly expensive bourbon, letting the rich, warm burn settle deeply in my chest. I stood perfectly still in the quiet, absolute luxury of my glass tower and smiled. It was the ultimate unapologetic piece of a woman who had willingly burned down a toxic kingdom just so she could rule her own empire completely undisturbed. The greatest lesson I learned is that family is not defined by blood, but by mutual respect and genuine support. For years, I allowed my toxic parents and spoiled sister to drain my resources and tear down my self-worth, all because I wanted their approval. Taking back my power meant accepting that I could never buy their love. I had to stop setting myself on fire just to keep them warm. True peace only comes when you find the absolute courage to walk away from the people who constantly disrespect you and finally build an empire of your own. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you believe in walking away from toxic relatives to protect your ultimate peace.